Tea time. Welcome everybody! Souldin of the Grin brothers here, and it's time for another episode of Tea Time. Now then, for today's tea time, I shall be having yet again another Davos Windsor Christmas calendar tea. A spiced orange with clove and peel tea. I believe I've had tea with clove before. Clove oil is often used as a medicine, and it numbs stuff in the mouth when I use it. And it smells absolutely horrendous, as does this tea. If I recall correctly, the last time I tried a tea out with clove, I found that if I held my nose, it actually made the tea taste a lot better. And the tea itself actually tasted good, but the smell of the clove often made it off-putting. So hopefully that'll be the case with this one. It's a black tea. Brew time is 3 to 6 minutes. I brewed it for 4 minutes. And information on it, which again, I had to look up. It's a wonderfully zesty tea with a well-balanced combination of Chinese black tea, orange peels and clove, a citrusy and spicy cuppa. Yeah, that should just about sum it up, and I will be sharing my thoughts on that later when I drink it. Now then, we've only got, due to having work tomorrow and 2 more teas left after that, so we've only got 3 more tea times, including this one, left to do for the Christmas calendar tea. I already have my Christmas Eve one in mind. But as for this tea time, well, I had a subject planned, but I figured I'd need to do just a little bit of remembrance of it, because it's a tea time subject idea I had in my head for a while. But I need to refresh my memory of the video to watch, and so I'd save it for later. And I had a tea time idea pop into my head, a very casual one, thanks to the previous tea time I did, which, unless I've uploaded a different tea time, maybe I did a Nintendo reaction or something. The last tea time I did was about my top 6 video game consoles I'd like to own, that I don't already own. And commenting on the consoles made me think about, well, console generations. And I guess to start things off, what's your favourite console generation? Doesn't have to be... And when I think about it, of course my favourite console generation is probably, in terms of the games I've played, probably the Wii, PS3, Xbox 360 era sort of thing. I mean, Nintendo Wii is my favourite video game console. And more modern console generations allow you to play a lot of the old games and such, but... And, maybe I have a soft spot thinking about to the Dreamcast, GameCube sort of era, PS2 and classic Xbox sort of thing. But in terms of, for the pure information... In terms of the pure history, because I like to actually read up on the history of video games and video game developers and consoles and such, that's why I buy the Retro Game magazine. But in terms of the history of video games and the sort of general generation of the events that went on and just the buzz of it all, I think the one I'm actually most interested in and like to look up the most is actually the 5th generation of video game consoles, which, funny enough, started when I was born. 1993 was the year that the 5th generation of video game consoles started. And so that's basically what I'm going to talk about, just the 5th generation of video game consoles and why I find it so fascinating. Why do I like to think about it? For instance, some of you may have heard me previously mention that if I were to ever make a webcomic, one of the 2 ideas I had when thinking, usually in the basis of if I could draw, one of the ideas I had was, video game company Djinka's personification sort of thing. It's been done before, but it's often done as the consoles rather than the companies themselves, which I think is limiting, because consoles then, the companies tend to continue on in a manner for majority of them. Nintendo is still around sort of thing, and a lot of the video game companies who no longer make consoles, like say SNK, still around, they're still making games and all that. In terms of... if I were to do such a sort of comic personification thing, if I had to focus on a particular generation, I'd probably focus on Generation 5. As I said, it starts off in 1993, so it has a bit of a cross-blend with Gen 4. And a lot of people think of Generation 5 as purely the N64, PlayStation, and the Sega Saturn. Sometimes the Sega Saturn. Sometimes they even leave the Sega Saturn out and think of it just as PlayStation versus N64. But as mentioned, the 5th generation started in 1993. And the 5th generation basically was the last hurrah for companies trying to enter the console market. It was the last time that people thought that a lot of people tried to make video game consoles. It was effectively the closest to a 2nd generation, closer in terms to the 2nd gen than anything. Nowadays, it's basically just the big 3. It is the Nintendo, the Microsoft, and the Sony sort of systems. But in the 5th gen, everyone tried to be sort of tried to get into that console space, or even tried to be the third console to compete alongside Nintendo and Sega. Of course, that ended up being PlayStation, and I feel that's a line pretty much directly taken from Adam Korolik's 5th generation video game retrospective, which I will link to you to in the description below, because I found it a fascinating sort of series of videos, him exploring the 5th generation of video game systems, and it also kind of sparked my interest in that, learning about it through him as well. But I find it really fascinating about the attempts that were made to enter the sort of video game market at that point. Some of them being complete newcomers, some of them being veterans of video game console making, and they all sort of went through it with consoles with a lot of unique appeals, and you can see what they were going for. And some weren't even trying to compete necessarily; they were just trying to make a console to end up catering to a niche market space. So okay, let's go back to 1993. Again, one of the really interesting things about it, aside from its, the 5th generation starting, when the SNES had only been out for like 2 years, 2 to 3 years, was that Japan, Europe, and America all had separate first 5th gen consoles. They had separate first 32-bit consoles. In Japan, the very first 32-bit console, and technically the first one of all, was the FM Towns Marty, which never released outside of Japan. In the UK and Europe, the first 5th gen console was the Commodore Amiga Cd42, which never released in America or Japan. And then in America, the first 5th generation console was the 3DO company's 3DO, which did eventually release in America and Japan. So I guess it's kind of the winner of the bunch. And in terms of the consoles, it actually came in 4th place out of all the 5th gens. I believe it sold it's definitely sold over 1 million. I think it managed to breach 2 million, which is admittedly kind of sad for it. Puts it in around the same range as the Nokia N-Gage. But they all tried to do some pretty cool things. The FM Towns Marty was taking basically the Fujitsu hardware and converting it into a sort of console. It was a disc as a base for it, which was pretty rare and not too successful with a lot of the others, and it was backwards compatible with all the previous Fujitsu CD-based games from your Fujitsu PCs. Again, more of a Japanese line sort of thing, but so it was doing some pretty cool things. Weirdly enough, had a 3-button controller only, but I mean, heck, the 3DO would make that mistake as well. So, and the Amiga CD32 basically used the same sort of logic. They took the Amiga 1200, turned it into a console. They did, however, add a unique chip to it. And their backwards compatibility, though, wasn't quite as impressive as Fujitsu's, but they were backwards compatible with the even less successful Commodore CD-TV. In the case of, whilst I'm not familiar enough with the FM Towns Marty to comment on, though I find it fascinating as the sort of first sort of entry into the 5th generation, I think the Amiga CD32 had potential, particularly in the fact that it could be upgraded through its expansion ports. However, it was, and I've mentioned this previously in the sort of top 6 consoles, it was hindered by the lack of research and development funding and the bankruptcy issues of Commodore already. It probably would have not fared too well once the Sega Saturn and PlayStation came out, unless a big sort of expansion pack had come out for it. But it was released at the end of 1993. So, it actually had 2 years before the Sega Saturn or the PlayStation would even arrive in its markets that it was released in. So, it had a good chance of actually getting a good lead and then having the expansion come out at a time where any expansion to improve its hardware would have been affordable enough to then try to go head-to-head with Sega Saturn and PlayStation. But that's all theoretical. Still, it's a really fascinating, and again, I had a lot of fun memories with the Commodore Amiga 1200. So, of course, a console-based version of that was pretty cool. And, of course, then there's a 3DO, which went into the video game market with an interesting mindset of trying to basically make a standardized forms for all video games. That obviously didn't work, and it ironically became just another competitor. But, it actually took did a fair dig at it. The hardware itself was actually pretty nifty. It definitely had... there's debates as whether FM Towns Marty was 32-bit. From what I've generally gathered, the 3DO was definitely 32-bit. It was, from what I heard, easy enough to develop for, particularly in the fact that it was really easy for third parties to get a hold of the development kits for it. In fact, a lot of developers actually ended up making their start with making a 3DO game and then transitioning, say, onto the PlayStation or the N64. And it was thanks to being able to get that sort of first sort of foot in the door with the 3DO that they were able to make a game on the 3DO and, test things out and, get used to things. It ended up being, admittedly, a dumping ground for experiments, as it were. The 3DO also wasn't quite, was kind of misguessed the future of video game systems. They thought that FMV would be a lot more important and focused a lot more on the FMV potential rather than the 3D power. So it wasn't as 3D capable as it could be. it clearly did show that it had 3D capabilities, but it was more so favouring the idea that FMV would be incorporated into a lot of games. So from the seams of it, a lot of the power was spent in terms of making it suitable for FMV. But from what I hear, it did put some great usages of FMV. It actually has an FPS game where all the characters are actually actors done in an FMV sort of style, FMV characters as you're sort of shooting through them, which is an incredibly cool idea. And if I were to ever own a 3DO, that's definitely a game I would seek out. Again, the control, it was kind of interesting, different manufacturers would produce different consoles and the controllers themselves would change. But the daisy chaining of controllers together was a fantastic idea. I mean, admittedly, pull and tug might cause problems. From here, the controller wires are actually pretty lengthy, so it's not usually an issue. But it was actually a really fantastic idea to get around the fact that there'd be so many different models that you couldn't predict how many controller ports were going to be on those consoles themselves. And, that's just the first 3, before any of the bigwigs show up. Along with that, you got like smaller attempts trying to aim at niche markets, not even trying to compete with the big powerhouses. You have the Casio Loopy, a Japan-only system by the calculator makers of Casio, aimed at a female-specific demographic. It was a video game console with a stamp maker. It printed out stamps and stickers. I think it was just stickers, but regardless, that's a really cool and novel idea that it did that, and kudos to them. That was definitely unique. From what I hear, it's generally not a very good system. Again, it's mainly focused on the sticker thing. It, for some reason, only had one controller port, which is a bit weird, because you think, they would actually have tried to have a bigger emphasis on the multiplayer, but there weren't too many games, as it were. From what I hear, the best one was like sort of Bow Wow, so I'll have the proper title pop up on the screen. It's a very weird game, but from what I hear, it's generally the most gamer game, as it were. The others are mostly usually sort of design or art tools or quiz games, which, they have their demographics, but it actually had the potential to I imagine modders could probably actually update it with various games, because its hardware is actually very similar to the 32X, the Sega Mega Drive add-on. So it wasn't the weaker end of the 32-bit system, but if it was based off the 32X of Sega system, it had the potential to be easier to develop for because of people who would have already used that Sega hardware. I mean, I'm not a huge tech expert sort of thing, but so there is the part chance that you could actually kind of just end up porting to it, like all the 32X games. You want to play Knuckles and Chaos and the Casio Loopy? I wonder if you could then make stickers based off Knuckles and the Chaos if you were to mod it into a Casio Loopy. And then the Bandai had the Playdia, which was like a quiz game based machine for the most part, and it's actually where that one Dragon Ball Z sort of plan to eradicate the Saiyans came from. It was actually a little quiz game on the Bandai Playdia, just another little Bandai doing a fun little for kids console. But they also made a serious attempt at a console with the Pippin, their collaboration with Apple, where Apple took a Macintosh, like the CD42 sort of thing, and made a console. Unfortunately, they did it very poorly, so, And the thing is, the Pippin actually had some cool ideas. The controller has a mouse ball, a little mouse wheel, in the middle of the controller. That is a fantastic idea, and why has no one else done that? That is amazing. Again, it's like the, when I mentioned the Xbox Series X video, which may not even be out yet, or may have come out after. The idea of the mouse wheel sort of shoulder buttons. I would love that. That's an amazing idea. Why aren't more people doing it? I'm not even big on, PC controls, mouses and such thing, but the mouse wheel idea is really cool, and I'm surprised no one did that. And the Apple Pippin controller does have that. It's got actually a pretty neat little look to it. I like the look of it, sort of all. But unfortunately, it doesn't really have many games that really were of any good, and no one really took advantage and took any notice of it. And it's so poorly put together that you can actually see the Mac OS screen pop up for a brief couple seconds before it actually boots up the Pippin. So it doesn't even try to hide the fact that it is just the Mac turned into a console. The Amiga Cd42 at least had a cool little sort of opening screen and everything. And interesting enough, its best game is actually made by Bungie. Super Marathon, a port of Marathon 1 and Marathon 2. The Marathon trilogy of games being basically Bungie's, the Apple Macintosh's answer to Doom. And apparently are really good games, and not just as FPS games, but more so than Doom, they had really cool stories to them. Showing that Bungie would of course, that kind of makes sense. Bungie would let it go on to make Halo. But the Apple Pippin didn't really do very well. It's kind of seen as a failure, but it's just fascinating. Again, so many people trying to enter it. The TurboGrafx successor, by NEC, the PCFX, failed spectacularly, unfortunately. They had weird rulings and a bigger emphasis on it being able to basically do anime graphics rather than actually 3D powers. They made some pretty unique games with its limitation, but eventually became basically a visual novel and hentai machine. Though I guess if you're into that, the PCFX is there for you. Apparently, it's apparently gorgeous for anime cutscenes and such. Again, why it ended up being used for hentai. So it's great for cutscenes, and it had some unique ideas done for it, and there were games that worked for it, but it was never going to compete with the 32-bit powerhouses, as it were. They used an outdated Hudson 32-bit architecture for it, from what I hear. Hudson had made a sort of 32-bit thing for them to use, I think, back with the Super Graphics, and NEC decided to use it way too late. When at that point Hudson had already upgraded to powerful hardware. And of course they also decided to drop using any of the Hudson's main brands. So it's like, we'll be a success without Bomberman and Bonk and all the sort of titles that made a success on the TurboGrafx. So you can see why the PCFX didn't succeed. But again, it's kind of fascinating. Also, they just didn't even bother trying to disguise it. They just basically, it's just a PC tower, effectively. And then, and heck, even outside of those, you got all the handhelds that came out around the time. The Game Boy Color, the Neo-Geo Pocket Color, the Bandai Wonder Swan, the Tiger Electronics, R-Zone, and Gamecom. Fascinating to see, who actually sort of tried to take on Nintendo's dominance with the Game Boy at that point. And to be fair, Nintendo had planned to phase out the Game Boy around that point. They were planning to consider a 32-bit Atlanta. I think Project Atlantis is what they were calling it. They were basically trying to consider the Game Boy Advance at that point. But Pokemon came out. Pokemon rejuvenated interest in the Game Boy. So the Game Boy ended up going on for free, because they're planning to cancel it around 1996 to 1998. And it ended up going on for 3 to 5 more years as a result of Pokemon's success. And again, I find the Bandai Wonder Swan was apparently really popular and had a lot of support. Square Enix in particular supported it a lot. The Final Fantasy Advance games were actually just ports of the Bandai Wonder Swan games. And both of the handhelds did really unique things. The Gamecom also really pushed itself in really innovative ways. 2 cartridges, so you could have 2 games at once, and online connectivity back in the late 90s on a handheld. Amazing stuff. Too bad the system was terrible. Apparently it worked well enough for puzzle games, but it couldn't do any real 3D games. Apparently a Duke Nukem game is, one of the better ones, but it's not good. But that's as good as you can get with it. I mean, they tried to have Sonic Jam on it, and oh my gosh, the Sonic games cannot run on the Gamecom. It's, and then the Tiger R-Zone is trying to cause you epilepsy. And then, of course, you got the Atari trying to make a comeback with the Atari Jaguar, and that's, it was Atari's last stand, and it failed spectacularly, but there's a lot of charm to it, and heck, Rayman was originally designed for the Atari Jaguar. That is also a really interesting fact. The controller looks awkward, but from what I hear from people who've actually used it, it's actually surprisingly comfortable. And the number pad thing, a very Atari-like mindset, and works a lot, from what I hear, works well with the mech tank games and the battle tank games that they had in mind for it. And the number pad could actually have had a lot of potential uses if people were designing exclusively for the Atari Jaguar. Unfortunately, the Atari Jaguar was a pain in the ass to actually create games for, but hey, again, it was unique. That's kind of the thing, all the video game consoles are starting to blend together a bit, but back in the 5th gen, there were so many competitors, and they were all doing something unique with them. And then there's the Sega Saturn, the PlayStation, and then N64. N64 was a 3D powerhouse sort of thing. The PlayStation was easy to develop for, and had great sound quality, and ended up capturing a lot of attention and ended up translating a lot of the sort of games. And the Sega Saturn was a 2D powerhouse and actually had a strange situation where it had tons of Japanese games. And it's kind of funny when I think about it. I'm a big fan of turn-based games, but aside from the PlayStation, not many of the systems actually had their turn-based games ported overseas. So, if I were to actually sort of invest for future time into the 5th gen, it's a lot of the games I'd want would probably actually be in Japanese, and I wouldn't understand a word of them. The 3DO from my here actually has a exclusive turn-based RPG, which is interesting, which actually did get ported overseas, which is, really interesting. But, yeah, the Sega Saturn has always had a fascination. And, of course, again, part of what ended up capturing my attention with the 5th gen is that, effectively, it's the consoles I grew up on. I mean, of course, I got to experience the SNES, the Mega Drive, the Game Boy, and the Amiga 1200, thanks to my brothers owning them. But By the time I was old enough to really be aware of video games, the N64 and the PlayStation were already out, so that was the point that I really started to get into video games, and there was kind of a bit of a blur as to which generation I started off with. Honestly, it's probably more so to say that I more started off with the N64 and PlayStation being my childhood, and so there's a lot of fondness for those childhood days. And yet, what truly draws me to the 5th generation is the history of it. In fact, the systems I never played, you know, just all these people sort of like, effectively like a better version of the 2nd gen, as it were, where the 2nd gen, everyone's systems, there wasn't enough to really make them stand out, as unless you're the Vectrex. But then in the 5th gen, everyone's systems had something to stand out. Some really weirdly, and not very well, but they stood out. They were all very different to beasts, and you know, I love that. I just love reading about just how different they are, and I love reading about all these companies who thought we could have a good success of being the 3rd competitor, and then weirdly enough, none of them became the 3rd competitor technically, because Sony killed Sega effectively, and Microsoft rose from Sega's ashes effectively, because again there was partnerships between Microsoft and Sega Dreamcast, for instance, and became the 3rd competitor, but that wouldn't be sort of really resolved until the 6th gen. Interesting how things go, and again, it's just something I like. I like reading about it. It's something I like reading about. Anyway, I'm gonna try out this tea. I haven't got any milk with it, even though it's a black tea. But here we go. Ooh, nice and spicy. Yeah, it is. They actually commented, it's a tea if you don't want to try chai, and yeah, it actually kind of tastes like a chai. Not as spicy. The orange kind of soothes it out a bit. Probably should have brewed it for a bit longer. And as per usual, yeah. That was a little bit bad. The orange was a little bit bad there. The orange flavour, I think, is more towards the bottom. It sort of had the nice sort of spice to it, and then the tip of my tongue had a burst of citrus, which was pretty cool. The citrus kind of fizzles out really quickly, but the spice kind of starts slowly crawling to your back. Not very quickly. It's starting to fizzle out now. Shame. But yeah, the smell, unfortunately, takes away from it, so don't sniff as you drink or hold your nose. And the moment you do that, well, okay, don't hold your nose as you drink. Let's go. But basically, don't sniff. As you would drink it, and the tea will taste a lot better, because gosh, clove is such a terrible smell, but it makes a great tasting tea. Not great tasting medicine, I will tell you that. Like, I usually like the taste of medicines, but clove oil, drawing that in my mouth, oh my gosh, that is one of the worst things ever. But yeah, that was my thoughts on the 5th generation. Just more of a rambling sort of thought. I find them... Did I miss anyone? Actually no. I only kind of briefly went over the handhelds, which is a shame, because again, I have a real interest in the SNK Neo-Geo Pocket Color, and as mentioned, the Bandai WonderSwan was a big hit in Japan and had a lot of support from various companies, a lot of support from Square Enix and from Namco, and so it's quite interesting to dig into that maybe more in depth. And then, of course, there's a whole history of Gunpei Yokoi with it, and then, of course, the Neo-Geo Pocket Color I have an invested interest in. It's a handheld I do really wish I owned. So I guess I could have probably gone into more of that, but in any case, that's kind of why the 5th generation of video game consoles fascinates me. There's a childhood connection. It's the last hurrah of other companies trying to enter. Nowadays, we don't really have to think about who else is going to try and compete with the big three. Who else is going to try to be the next big console? Because they're all side consoles now. They're all the Casio Lupis and Bandai Players of their era now. They're not trying to be the Atari Jaguar or the 3DO, where they're trying to become the next big wig. There's a lack of ambition, unfortunately. But I guess in this day and age, the console space is, I feel it's been so well dominated and cemented these last 3 gens. This space, it feels like there's not enough room for other consoles. And to be fair, they're all starting to feel a little bit similar. So I guess the 3DO's prediction of trying to make a singular hardware, in a sense, kind of started to come true. In any case, that's my thoughts on the 5th generation of video game consoles. Feel free to tell me what you thought about this tea time and my thoughts of the 5th generation of video game consoles. Feel free to tell me what you think about the 5th generation of video game consoles. And feel free to tell me what you think is the most interesting generation of video game consoles. Be it your favourite to play, your favourite to just talk about or to learn about and read up on and see what the systems are. I'd love to hear your opinions, and cheerio!